agreements like World Trade Organization. We have economic and monetary unions, common markets, free trade agreements. This is the USMCA, US, Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement, which before had been called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Characterized by free exchange of currencies, allows for foreign direct investment. Tools can be used to improve cooperation or to escalate conflict. And we can see that over here, tariffs and quotas, moving from cooperative to a non-cooperative stance. Even among countries within a trading bloc, one of them can decide that they're being treated badly and decide to impose tariffs and start moving towards a more non-cooperative stance. We can think of U.S. and China under the Republican administration from 2016 to 2020. Tariffs were introduced on China for certain products, and of course there was retaliation with China saying, well, we're going to impose tariffs on this stuff coming from you guys. More tools of collaboration that are used, the less likely it is that a country will initiate conflict or use non-cooperative tools. So as you move more from trading blocs or free trade agreements into common markets and monetary unions, the countries connected to that are less and less likely, not that they won't, not that it never happens, they're less and less likely to use non-cooperative tools. Okay, on to another LOS right now. So we're really highlighting the stress on the word introduction here. Describe geopolitical risk and its impact on investments. And we have three types of geopolitical risk: event risk, exogenous risk, and thematic risk. This is the vocabulary of the field. If you're in the field of geopolitics, that's the vocabulary that's used. If you are a financial market participant, you are aware of events versus trends. And I'm sure you've heard the expression, we trade events, but we invest in trends. We would consider these events, we would consider this the trend. But let's talk about it in the language of geopolitics. An event risk is the risk around a very specific date. So we know there's a date on which something will happen, we just don't know what's going to happen. Things like elections, or the vote on a key piece of legislation, whether it be a change in tax laws or introduction of new regulation. There is some date on which it's going to happen, so that is referred to as event risk, when we can actually put our finger on the calendar and say it's going to be on this date, we just don't know what's going to happen. Exogenous risk. Exogenous is unanticipated. Think of a pandemic. You can't plan for that. Think of wars, natural disasters. Unanticipated risk that impacts either a country's cooperative stance or the ability of non-state actors to globalize, or both at the same time. We think of invasions, natural disasters being the more common one, but invasions do happen. When they happen, it hits currency and commodity markets almost immediately. And it lasts for as long as the risk of that particular exogenous event lasts. But those are events. Now, those events can spill over into more thematic risks. So we can think of natural disasters, floods and hurricanes occurring. Well, with the globes, or the world's, call it the planets. I'm trying to find the right word here. With the planets, climate systems and climate patterns changing, along with a warming climate and warming oceans, you are getting more and more events that are happening. So there is, while it is exogenous risk, the rising frequency at which we are observing that risk is becoming more thematic, evolve and expand over a long period of time. So we can think of climate change, immigration patterns, and the rise of something called populism. Assessing threats, and whenever there is a risk or a threat, you have to look at it in terms of, well, how likely is it to happen? If it does happen, how quickly is it going to affect things? And if based on that, how badly will it affect things? So some things may be very likely that will happen immediately but have almost no effect. And some things may have a very low likelihood may spread slowly, but once it starts, it's hard to reverse, and it could have a very bad impact. So you have to assess the probability that it will occur, and probabilities like this, mostly subjective. Velocity, the pace at which geopolitical risk impacts on investor portfolios. And whenever you have geopolitical risk, it shows up in currencies and commodities, the commodities that are affected by that particular region and the currencies of that region and surrounding regions. It will show up there first and fast, typically. And the impact, high or low, discrete or broad. So it may have high impact on a particular sector. It may have low impact on a sector, or it may have low impact over the broad economy as a whole. All right, let's tie it to the last part of this statement, impacts on investment. This is where we want to end up at, is changes in portfolio risk exposures. We can look at different threats in terms of short-term, medium-term, or long-term impacts. And some short-term threats or that appear in the short term may actually turn out to have longer-term effects, can spill over into medium-term threats, which may even spill over into longer-term threats. So in white, I have some examples of short-term. Think back to early 2022. Russia invades Ukraine. And at the time, the thinking was that this would be some event that happens in that area, but it does have some end date, how it's going to end. Nobody knew at the time, but that it wasn't seen as something that would be medium-term or long-term. Any particular terrorist attack, for example, we can think of the most famous one going back to New York City, 9/11, with the World Trade Center. Airplanes into the World Trade Center. That was a big event, but it did have spillovers in that it changed the whole tone of national security. The way that you went through an airport has been forever changed on that. So it did have some longer-term implications in terms of trends in security. Medium-term, pandemic, that doesn't just last a couple of months, but a few years, and it does have longer-term effects as well, or it has the potential to spill over into not just medium-term, but longer-term effects, changes in behavioral patterns, changes in the way work is structured, the cities are designed. And long-term, the shift from internal combustion, which was dominant for 100 years around the globe, to electronic vehicles. Autonomous vehicles and self-driving vehicles, especially long-haul trucks, and think of the amount of employment that is going to have to shift out of that sector as autonomous vehicles, which are not going away, by the way, they're just going to become better and better, will become mainstream at some point. The idea of the metaverse and also central bank digital currencies. I'm not pointing to any private digital currencies. I believe they will all disappear and be replaced by central bank digital currencies. But these are trends that will have longer term effects. So we move from events, which are very short term, all the way to trends, which are long term. And an event could have trend like characteristics over time, which then becomes a trend. Events are typically associated with high levels of market volatility. And to determine how we would change our investments from this, whenever we have some event, whether it be short term, and we don't know whether something is medium term or short term when it first shows up or not, it's just some event that we have to deal with, we'll have some base case as to what it means and how it resolves itself. And then you will have an optimistic upside and a more pessimistic downside depending on the trajectory of that particular threat. And as time passes, there'll be particular signposts. These are different levels, like, for instance, interest rate levels, currency levels, market levels, or different economic indicators that will give you some idea of which direction we happen to be going in. And this makes it look like it's rather binary. But you may have signposts here. Let's say 11 of 21 are suggesting we're here, whereas 10 of the 21 indicators suggest we're here. So that at any given time you have a potential quantum difference between the two, is which way are we moving? It's not a particle but a wave at that point, right? Even as you move further on, you'll still have some indicators that say you're here, and you'll have some indicators that say you're here. Or you may have a trajectory which operates like this, where the indicators are predominantly suggesting we're here, and then you move here, then something happens, and then you end up here. So it's not as if we have some base case today, we have upside and downside, and we're going to watch our indicators along the way. It's every week we're adjusting our base case, or every month you adjust your base case based on where you think you are, and then you develop new upside or downside scenarios. So it's a continual process of monitoring. But depending on what the signposts are saying, you may then want to increase your risk exposure to certain assets, or decrease your risk exposures to certain assets, certain asset classes, certain geographies for those particular asset classes. So you may say, that's it, I'm out of European bonds and emerging market bonds, and I'm going to move into US, Japanese, and Swiss bonds only, or move into those currencies, or move out of some equity markets into other equity markets, or just move out of equity markets into bond markets. Our last learning objective deals with the trade organizations. And there's a lot of issues surrounding these three organizations that we're going to talk about. You pretty much got to make up your own mind about whether you think that they're either good or bad, because there's a lot of reasons why people don't like them, and there's a lot of reasons why, when they were set up initially, they were all good things. However, they're still operating today on a mandate they had at the end of World War II when they were set up, and there is a mismatch between who runs these things and who they're being run for. But you can look into that yourself. Let's just look at what they are. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, oversees the fixed exchange rate agreements between countries. The fixed exchange rate agreements helps governments manage their exchange rates and provides short-term capital to aid balance of payments. They do this mostly to prevent the spread of a crisis. That if there's a crisis because of some issue with the balance of payments, the IMF is ready to step in and be the dam. It's to stop this flow from spreading further than where it is to try to contain it, to prevent the spread of the crisis. The World Bank helps developing countries fight poverty and enhance environmentally sound economic growth. That sounds nice, doesn't it? Helps them fight poverty. They have two branches inside: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the International Development Association. Both of these are not for profit. Again, still sounds kind of nice. Well, they're not in it for the money. Look at the names: Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Development Association, fight poverty, environmentally sound economic growth. So far, so good. They provide low or no interest loans and grants to countries with either no, few, or bad options. Again, this is beautiful. Everything sounds great. How did these people do it? Well, this is what's called a supranational organization, and when you get to the fixed income reading, you'll see that supranational organizations issue bonds, and those bonds are rated AAA. So they can borrow at AAA rates. They then take these rates that they borrow at and they pass it on to these lower countries, to these countries, not lower countries, but these countries that would have terrible credit ratings and have to borrow at really high rates. In other words, they have no, few, or bad options. So all of a sudden, through the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, they can get low rates. What is so bad? How can anyone look at this and say, well, that's not such a good thing? Here's why. This line comes with conditions. This is called policy-based lending. Policy-based lending. And what this is saying is that we'll lend you, we'll give you all of this to help you out here, but here are the policies we want to see you put in place. Number one is we want you to open up your economy. Number two, if your government is owning any enterprises, we want you to privatize those. Number three, if you have high-cost production in certain areas like food or whatever the case is, stop doing that and rely on imports. That typically ends up hurting a poor country more than it ends up helping a poor country, because most of the policies of the IMF and the World Bank are set up and decided and put in place by the rich countries. So even though the mandate is to help at the bottom, it's to help in a way that allows trade that, while the argument is it benefits everyone, it benefits the bigger, richer countries faster and sooner than it does the poor countries. In other words, this policy-based lending ends up being just as no, few, or bad option as the no, few, or bad options for some specific countries. That's the big argument against it. And when you listen to these countries state their arguments, your conclusion of that is, they got a point there. They got a pretty good point there that makes a lot of sense. That if this loan, if it were really magnanimous, if it were really to fight poverty, and if it really was to provide low interest or no interest grants to countries, there would be no policy-based lending. It would just be a loan. But that loan is tied to this thing called policy-based lending. So understand what they're doing, but also look at, well, what about the receiving end? How does it look at from the receiving end? Because a gun looks very different depending on what side of the gun you're standing on, right? Let's move on. And our last organization is the World Trade Organization. So we have the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. World Trade Organization regulates cross-border trade relationships globally. It reviews and monitors trade policies to make sure that there are no violations. It is also the court of appeals for all of these. If one country says, hey, that country is doing something wrong, they'll go to the World Trade Organization, and the WTO will issue a statement saying, okay, well, because of that thing going on, here's our remedy for that situation. Implements, administers, and operates individual agreements, and, like I said, settles disputes. That's all you really need to know about the WTO for the learning objective. But countries are more apt to rely on regional trading agreements than going to the WTO, because the WTO is slow and inefficient, and regional trading agreements can be tailored easier and better to the motivation and causes and needs of the particular region. So that the WTO is in danger of sort of almost being irrelevant when you could just create a regional trading bloc and just ignore the WTO, right? There it is. There is your introduction to geopolitics. And again, let me stress the word here that it was introduction. It was mostly to the vocabulary of the field, so that when you're listening to anybody speaking on the topic of geopolitics, you understand the vocabulary that they're using. But in no way does this prepare you to begin to analyze geopolitics or geopolitical risks on a more global basis. I think it could have been a little bit richer, a little bit deeper, but for that you would have needed an expert, and I don't think the author is an expert.